Chapter 3. I finished washing the last of the supper dishes and went back to join the kids in the living room. It was starting to look as if the McBrides had melted. Where were they? They could have at least called to let me know where they were and when they would get here. I was happy that Susie had drifted off. She and Daisy were all snuggled up together in a little ball on the floor, looking like a picture in a calendar. David sat, stone still, on the Chesterfield, watching the television. He'd given up trying to improve the reception. The picture was fuzzy, flashing and rolling and fading, and the sound cracked and popped. I would have told him to turn it off long ago if it hadn't been for the weather updates. Some of the news was reassuring. They were predicting that the rain would stop sometime during the night. We were getting the tail end of a hurricane. They called it Hurricane Hazel, that had hit way down south in the United States. Thank goodness we weren't down there, where the hurricane could do real damage. However, most of what was reported was just disturbing. The roads were a mess of accidents, stalled cars, downed hydro wires, and fallen trees. Power was out in large parts of the city, and phones weren't working in some areas. I jumped up a couple of times to pick up the receiver, just to make sure they were still a dial tone. It was amazing how comforting that buzzing sound was. One time, the announcer said that the downtown hotels were filling up with people unable to drive home. I was sure that wasn't the case with Mr. and Miss McBride, though. They were taking a long time, but they were still coming. I was positive. I wondered what would happen if my father got here first. I'd even thought about just tucking the kids into bed and leaving with him, but I knew there was no way I could do that, no matter how much I wanted to go home. My father would just wait, unless we all went back to our house. We could do that. There was certainly room in the truck for all of us. We could even bring Daisy. Poor dog would have to get wet getting to the truck, but we couldn't leave her alone either. I would just leave the McBrides a note telling them where we were. I walked over to the front window and peered out into the darkness once again. Occasionally lights would appear on the edge of the valley, cars moving along the road. At least somebody was moving. And I could hope that the next set of lights might turn down the road and come toward us, and that it would be Mr. and Miss McBride. Or even better, my father. I could just picture his tow truck splashing through the street, turning into the driveway, my father jumping out of the cab wearing his big black slicker and running up to the house and deciding what we all needed to do. "Do you think we should move her upstairs?" David asked. "What?" I turned away from the window. He pointed to Susie. "Do you think we should try to move her upstairs?" "Let her sleep until your parents get home. As long as she's asleep, she isn't worried," I said. "Are you worried?" "Yeah, right. Like I'm afraid of some rain." "It's a whole lot of rain." "That's just a whole lot of nothing to worry about." "Are you worried?" he asked. I didn't answer. I didn't want to lie. He snorted. "Why don't you roll into a little ball with Susie and Daisy and you can go to sleep and I'll babysit everybody." "I'm not worried." "You're looking and acting worried." He was pushing me again, looking for an argument. Why didn't he just go back to watching the television and ignoring me? "I'm just concerned about your parents, aren't you?" It was David's turn to be silent. Now I'd made him uneasy. What a great babysitter I was, scaring the kids instead of reassuring them. "I'm sure they'll be home soon," I said quickly. "Until they get here, we'll just watch television. Do you want me to get you something else to eat?" He hadn't eaten much supper. "Thanks. That would be nice." It seemed like the least I could do after what I'd said. I walked into the kitchen and had just opened the fridge when suddenly the lights went out again and I was standing in semi-darkness. The little candle in the egg cup was still sitting on the counter, and the light that had seemed so weak and faint was now strong and warm and welcoming. "The lights will be back on soon," I said loudly enough for David to hear. "Please come back on," I pleaded quietly under my breath. I started counting. I reached 10. Still no lights. I lit a second candle and walked back to the living room, careful not to let it go out. "Do phones work in the dark?" David asked. "Why wouldn't they? You can talk in the dark." "You don't need electricity to talk." "Do phones work when there's no power?" he asked. I didn't know. I never even thought about it. I grabbed the phone out of the cradle and put it up to my ear. Instant relief. "It's working. There's a dial tone." "That just means that it has a dial tone. Call somebody. Why don't you call Donnie and tell him you don't like him like that?" I wanted to tell him to shut up. Instead, I started to dial. I knew who I wanted to talk to. There was a brief hesitation after I dialed the 7th number, and then it started to ring. It was picked up immediately. Hello? It's me, Mom. Oh, Lizzie, I was just talking to your father. His truck is stalled. She sounded worried. But how is he going to pick me up? Now I was getting worried. You'll have to stay there tonight. Miss McBride said that Mr. McBride would drive me home. Given how your father has described the roads, I think there's a very good chance that they won't be able to reach you tonight. But wouldn't they have called if they weren't coming home? Maybe they can't get to a phone that's working. Phones and power are out in places across the city. My electricity just went out again a few minutes ago. Do you still have power? It just went out. Do you have candles or flashlights? She asked. Candles. I have a couple burning now. Be careful with the flames. Make sure you blow them out before you go to bed tonight. Mom, I'm not a kid. But despite those words, it suddenly sank in. I was sleeping here. Maybe with just the kids. Me watching, being in charge. I know, Lizzie, but you'll always be my kid. I want you to call me if you hear from the McBrides or if they get home. I'll call right away. And call me once or twice before you go to bed. We'll just hope the phones continue to work. They're calling Hurricane Hazel the storm of the century, and the phones might go down, the way the electricity did. I felt as if there were butterflies in my stomach. Lizzie, I wish you were right here beside me. Not nearly as much as I wished the same thing, no matter how confident I was trying to sound. But I'm so glad for the sake of those children that you're right there, she went on. Can you imagine how terrible it would be for them to be there by themselves? I looked over at Susie, sleeping, snuggled in with Daisy. David wouldn't admit it, but he needed me to be there too. And Lizzie, I love you. I love you too. I'll talk to you soon. I put the phone down and took a deep breath, trying to chase away the butterflies. I didn't want to sleep here tonight. I didn't even want to be here right now. I peered through the window. If there had been a bit more light, and I'd looked hard enough, I might have actually made out a couple of houses on my street. So close, and yet so far. Maybe I couldn't go to my bed, but it was time to get Susie into hers. She was still sleeping peacefully on the floor. Gently, I lifted her up. Her head flopped to the side, but she didn't wake up. David, I said softly, can you take one of the candles and lead the way, please? How about if I do this instead? A beam of light shot out, illuminating the entire staircase. You have a flashlight? No, I have 2 flashlights. A second beam shot straight into my eyes, blinding me until I turned my head. He turned it off. Why didn't you tell me you had flashlights? You seem to like the candles. Besides, I didn't want to waste the batteries. Help me upstairs. David led the way and trailed the light behind him so I could see the stairs. Susie wasn't big, but she was a dead weight, and I struggled as I climbed, being careful not to trip. Her room was right at the top of the stairs. David pulled back the bed covers, and I laid her down and tucked her in. She was still in her clothes, but I didn't want to wake her. Her eyes opened ever so slightly. It's bedtime. Go to sleep, I whispered. Good night, Elizabeth. Her eyes closed again. I gave her a little kiss on the cheek. As I stood up, Daisy jumped up onto the end of the bed. She made a little circle and then settled in. I scratched her behind the ears. Then David handed me a flashlight, and we tiptoed back downstairs. We both walked over to the front window and looked out. I knew he was feeling worried. We were both worried, but neither of us wanted to talk about it. Do you think it's slowing down? He asked. I'm almost afraid to say it, but I think it is. The last news flash before the electricity went out said it was supposed to slow down or even stop, maybe even before midnight. What time is it? I turned on the flashlight so I could see my wristwatch. It's almost 10. I've never seen rain like this, David said. Not just today. It's rained every day for the last 10 days, and nonstop for the last 3 days. I guess that's why it's slowing down, David said. No more rain left to fall. I'm glad the lightning has stopped. Not me. At least we got little bursts of light to see what was happening outside. Now it's just dark. He looked over at me. Do you think my parents are going to make it home tonight? I'm sure they're still trying. It's pretty rough out there. I think they should stop trying, he said. It might be better if they just stayed put and waited out the storm. I hadn't expected him to say that. I thought he'd want them home and me gone. We'll be okay, David said. There are worse things than not having electricity. This is sort of like camping, that's all. I guess you're right, I admitted. We stood side by side looking out the window into the darkness. Occasionally, car headlights would briefly appear up on the side of the valley. It was reassuring to know that some vehicles were still on the road. You know, I don't need a babysitter. What? I don't need a babysitter. I couldn't believe he was going into this again now, with everything else that was going on. If he was being so stubborn and stupid, maybe I should just leave him here, right here and now. Of course, I couldn't do that. I just wanted you to know that. There was no point in getting into a fight, no matter how much he wanted to. I guess without television, he needed something to pass the time. I wasn't going to play his game. Actually, I'm going to tell your parents how good you've been through this. You are? Look, David, I know you could take care of yourself and Susie. You're just figuring that out now? He asked. Again, I decided I wasn't going to fight. I didn't say a thing. But you know, he said, I'm glad you're here. That surprised me. No, that shocked me. Had I heard him wrong? It's good, you know, for Susie. I think it makes her feel better. Then, after a pause, he asked, Where are you going to sleep tonight? I hadn't really thought about it. Maybe here on the Chesterfield. It's not very comfortable. You can have my room if you want. I'll sleep down here, David offered. Thanks, David, but I don't want to put you out. Besides, when your parents get home, it'll be easier this way, in case your father wants to drive me home. I hadn't given up on that thought completely. Okay, but let me know if you change your mind. Thanks. What about Daisy? I asked. Doesn't she have to go out one more time? Yeah, usually my father takes her out before he goes to bed. That's what I thought. How about you bring Daisy down and get her leash on, and I'll brave the storm, I suggested. David went upstairs. I took my socks down from the coat hook. They were still damp. I hung them back up and slipped into my saddle shoes, which were also still wet. Then I slipped on my damp, cold raincoat. I shivered, dreading getting soaked again. David was dragging Daisy down the stairs by her collar. She definitely did not want to leave Susie and her warm bed, and she probably knew what this was leading to. He took down her leash and clicked it on. I won't go too far, I said. Daisy won't let you go too far. I took her leash and started to open the door. It was wrenched out of my hand and almost caught me in the side of the head. The wind was incredibly strong, and the rain was being driven almost horizontally. I struggled to pull Daisy through the doorway. She dug in her heels, and it was a battle, pulling her, pushing through the wind, and fighting against the driving rain. I'll get the door, David yelled over the noise of the wind and rain. He pulled his shoulder into the door and closed it behind us. The rain was like hundreds of painful little pellets stinging my face. I turned my head, but there was no escape. The rain seemed to be coming from every side. I stepped off the porch and into a puddle deeper than my shoes. I sloshed forward another step. Now both feet were ankle deep in water. It wasn't a puddle. It was a pond. A lake. The whole front yard was underwater. I towed Daisy down the drive, through the water, and to the street, dipping my head and bending over to fight my way through the wind. Raymore wasn't a road anymore. It was a river. It was almost dark, but it didn't matter. I could hear the water rushing down the street. In the faint light, I could see objects moving in the water. A piece of wood, a flattened lawn chair, a garbage can lid, spinning around, caught in the current. Unbelievable. If I stepped onto the road, I would be stepping into a river about half a foot deep. Would the current knock me off my feet, carry me away like another piece of debris? My heart sank as I realized there was no way a car would be coming down this street anytime soon. We were cut off from the world by the flowing river of Raymore. I looked down at Daisy. She was a pudgy little anchor holding me in place, little legs practically lost beneath the water. She looked miserable. There was no way she was going to pee in this torrent. There was no point in even being out here. I turned back toward the house, and she surged forward, towing me along this time. She wanted to get back to the house even more than I did. We climbed the steps, out of the freezing water, onto the porch. I knew we should just go inside, but there was something about standing out there and letting the storm hit me full force. Inside, even though I could see the rain, hear it against the windows and roof, it wasn't the same. Out here, with it stinging my face, my feet soaked, the sounds not filtered through the walls of the house, it was completely real. That should have made it more scary, but somehow it didn't. We'd handled the worst that the storm could dish out, and we were still standing. It could take away the electricity, but it couldn't get inside the house and harm us. It might be dark, but it was dry. We were safe. Safe as houses. Daisy tugged at the leash and pawed at the door, whining. Obviously, she wasn't enjoying this moment the way I was. I opened the door, and the force of the wind combined with Daisy propelled me through. I dropped the leash and then pushed hard against the door to close it. Finally, I peeled off my jacket and kicked off my soaked shoes. I didn't even want to think of what all this water was doing to them. Here, David said. He was standing on the stairs in his pajamas. He threw down a blanket and I caught it. "What's it like out there?" he asked. "I think the rain is slowing down. I didn't really know, but I like to think that it was a little bit lighter. But the wind is still really strong." I wondered whether I should tell him the next part, but I figured I needed to share it. "The whole street is flooded. I don't think there's any way your parents can get here tonight." He nodded his head. "That's what I figured." He paused. "That's okay. You sure you don't want to sleep in my bed instead of down here?" "I'll be okay. See you in the morning." "Okay. Good night." He retreated back up the stairs. Funny, David's attitude seemed to get better as the situation got tougher. That was at least something to be grateful for. Maybe after I told his parents how he handled himself calmly and responsibly through this, they might agree he really could take care of Susie and himself. I'd be out of a job, but really, 5 days a week was a bit much, especially when one of those nights was as long as this one. I went to spread out the blanket on the Chesterfield and lie down, but I remembered I had to blow out the candle still burning in the kitchen. I blew it out and the room became darker with just the candle in the living room still glowing. The rain came down hard, like a sheet, hitting against the kitchen window. I walked over and put my hands against the glass to try to peer out, but there was nothing but black. Suddenly, the world was illuminated by a series of lightning strikes, one after the other. I could see the river. It had exploded from its banks and was cutting through the back of the yard, through the place where the shed and woodpile had once sat. They were gone. A shiver went up my spine. The road was like a river on one side of the house, and the river was rising on the other. It was as if we were on a little island. An island was a safe place to be, wasn't it? I wished my parents were here. Then I thought about the promise I'd made to call my mother. I went back to the living room and picked up the phone. No dial tone. Not a sound. No hum. Nothing. The phone was dead. It felt like being on a ship on a stormy sea. We had no power, no electricity, and now, without the telephone, we had no way to call back to shore. We were alone, and I was the captain.